You're listening to Amazing Radio. This is Amazing Afternoons. Delighted to say that Mull Historical Society, aka Colin MacIntyre, is on the line with me right now. Colin, how are you doing? It looks nice and sunny where you are.
Yeah, very well, Frankie. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the kind of I'm glad this Scottish weather we're having is working for everyone. Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, well, it's traveling down a little bit down on the northeast coast where I'm based this afternoon as well here for Amazing. But is the sun shining on your music? You've got a new single out, and
Yeah,
I've been listening to it. It's fantastic, but there's a bit of a backstory to this music, and it's in context with a larger piece of work as well, isn't it? Let's talk about the single first of all. 1952, first bit of music we've had from you for a little while, and I think it's genuinely really really great.
well, thank you. Yeah, the single is 1952, and I'll maybe can explain a little on that in a minute. But yeah, the backstory with the album is the album's called "In My Mind There's a Room," and basically I've recorded the album in a significant room to me, and I've asked a string of great authors, really, kind of Booker winners and US National Book Award winners, poet laureates, if they would give me original words on a significant room to them that I would then record in this room. So I kind of write books, Frankie, as well as my MHS identity. And so I've always wanted to bring my kind of worlds of literature and music together. And the significant room is really quite unlikely. It's back on the Isle of Mull, where I'm from, in Tobermory Main Street, and the bank building, the flat above the bank has become a studio. My grandfather was the bank manager for many years on Mull, and my grandparents lived in this flat, which looks right down one of the most beautiful, seafronts in Scotland. That's obviously a biased view, but the Scottish Tourist Board are never shy of using Tobermory in their publication. So, but yeah, he was a bank manager, but poet all his life. He was known as the Bard of Mull. His name was Angus MacIntyre, and he's still in print. Real character, he wasn't the normal bank manager. He went off on speaking tours, and every night the bank flat was a ceilidh and visiting. I remember Anthony Hopkins was making a movie in Mull, and he came up for a dram with my grandfather. People would just be sent to this quite, colourful poet bank manager who kept whiskey in his safe and all the rest of it. And so the room that he wrote his poetry in, and the rooms that I spent my childhood in, you could have knocked me over when I got the call about it. Had become a recording studio. One of my really good friends back home, who ran the art centre in Mull for many years, Gordon McLean, who's booked Laura Marling, Mumford and Sons. Loads of people have come up to play in Tobermory in the art centre. But Gordon left that and set up premises in my grandparents' old flat. So it was just, he said, look, come up and do a few tunes. You've got to be the first to record here. And I hadn't been in the flat in 20 years. Showing my age here, but Animal Cannabis, my third ever MHS single off my first album, Lost. I remember the weekend the family left the bank flat, my grandmother left, that had just come out actually, so I can sort of pinpoint it exactly because I remember getting a message about the chart position being in that flat. So yeah, it was great to go back in the rooms, and nothing really had changed, and actually to then take these authors' stories and mold them into songs. They took me to, Mexico City, New York, North Carolina, West Coast Ireland, Fife, all these different authors. But really, in some ways, it just felt quite natural to be back in those rooms with those stories, So, and the single 1952, the words are from probably the greatest living, most maybe famous living sort of Scottish poet, Liz Lochhead,
Yeah.
who was the sort of Scottish Macker, which is the Scottish poet laureate. And yeah, it's just about her first room of her own, in 1952, another coronation year, when she and her parents finally got their first house of their own, and she went from sharing in in-laws' bedrooms, to having our own room. And so it's really quite evocative, her words. And that's become the first single. So yeah, that's the kind of story behind it.
It's incredible, and I was doing a little bit digging on the record, and as a full piece of work, as a project, I guess music and poetry's crossed over quite a lot throughout time, but I don't think poetry, well, written by someone else, has then been adapted and sung like yourself is doing on this record. I mean, obviously, closer to home from a Scottish point of view, you got people like Aidan Moffat, who kind of more spoken word, and I guess John Cooper Clarke was a famous poet who crossed over into the music world as well. But I
Yeah,
can't think of any
interesting.
examples of people singing someone's poetry in a way. Where,
Yeah,
did you can you think of anyone, or what was what and were you always going to be singing it?
yeah, I was always going to be, but that's a really good point, Frankie, because actually Liz, it's interesting that her words set in in 1952. Then she talks about sort of 1962 when she got her first flat. She went to Glasgow School of Art with lots of kind of contemporaries, and but she sent me so many words that it's quite funny that actually her her words have become the upbeat kind of first single, 1952. But actually, she'd sent me so much, and because she's such a great voice, and she was up for coming up to Mull, up to the room. So she came up and actually read her entire piece. So she's on the album twice. She's on 1952, but then the penultimate track is called Anaglypta, and that is her poem in full and her reading it against me playing piano background. And it's called Anaglypta because that was one of the materials used. She basically reads out the paint chart of her first ever home, and then goes into Coronation Year, and then the final track is actually spoken word of my grandfather reading one of his poems, Memories of Mull, which is quite well known, on the West Coast and in the Highlands and Hebrides. So and that was read in the room back in the 70s. He used to read stuff out for different broadcasters and stuff. So but yeah, I mean, some of your listeners will know, Ian Rankin, Jacqueline Wilson, Nick Hornby. So the list is quite wide. I was trying to get some brownie points with my two girls, to get Jacqueline Wilson on there. I mean, I'm not sure I achieved it, but you can only try, And so Jacqueline Wilson talks about her first ever job, her first ever room. She was 17 and moved from South Coast England up to Dundee to work for the publisher there, D.H. Thompson, who many will know from the Beano and all the magazines that are published by them. And yeah, so she's quite evocative, her words, talking about this first room, her first room of her own. And basically she was in a linen cupboard. That was about all they could give her as a space. But for her, it was her first writing room. And full circle, D.H. Thompson also now publish her Jacqueline Wilson magazine, that my girls subscribe to, so it's amazing, her story. But people have just been really generous, and Ian Rankin's is My Bedroom Was My Rocket Ship. That's his track, which was really, as it says, his sort of teenage bedroom was posters on the wall, stories, just kind of the emergence of him as a crime writer, So yeah, it's been real fun. It's felt quite a privilege to almost have my hand on their doors, and just see where we go. But funnily enough, the person, Gordon, who's got the studio, who I mentioned earlier, is also a musician and recorded the album, engineered it. By the end of it, he was saying, it seems like they are your words. It's almost like they've sort of traveled through in a way, and I didn't maybe think that was going to happen, but it didn't feel that different, to me singing my own words, really.
Yeah. And
So
how were the initial approaches and negotiations with these people? I'd imagine you've rubbed shoulders with a few of these people before because
yeah,
of your literary background as well. But from my experiences as well, I've always found that other people in popular culture often want to to think of themselves or maybe experiment with different walks of life as well. For instance, I recently had a conversation with Pat Nevin, who is now writing books as well, the ex-footballer,
Yep.
and you can tell,
Yeah.
yeah, and in a different world, Pat would have been a musician in the 80s rather than a footballer, maybe. And I remember bumping into Ian Rankin on a Charlatans tour, and he was backstage, and he was like really loving being backstage. It was almost like and other footballers I've met in my life as well always ask me, "Oh, what's it like to be a musician?" And I've been in on the other side, being like, "What's it like to be a footballer?" So, did that
Yeah.
help in terms of your negotiations with these people to get them involved? Were they up for it from the start?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had the same sort of thought, I had the same thought of people I've met, people I thought, I knew Ian Rankin has had a punk band back in the day when he was
Yeah,
a student. Obviously, has taught a lot about music. I mean, Rebus, his famous crime character, shares Ian's love of music. Um, and likes of Nick Hornby, I'd had, yeah, I'd had sort of interaction with Nick before. He was the first I actually just thought, because I had Nick's email, so I fired it to him, tried to pitch the story of my grandfather in this flat. And actually, Nick's big breakthrough novel, Fever Pitch, that many people will know and became a film about his kind of love of Arsenal and the divorce of his parents. And it's really evocative. I realized after I'd contacted him, I first read Fever Pitch in that room in my grandparents' room back in the sort
comes
of
back
late
again,
90s.
comes back
Yeah,
again.
yeah, exactly. A visiting uncle who was coming back home, had plunked it in the coffee table and said, "You need to read that." And but Nick came back just saying, a couple of lines, "How could I not be involved? Love to. This is," and I thought, okay, well, we're off to a start. But, people like that who obviously, Nick's famous book, High Fidelity, which became the film, John Cusack, that's obviously got a lot of music in it as well. And interestingly, another little link is the artwork is an original painting, which maybe we can post up for
Yeah,
listeners, with from John McLean, who was one of the founding members of the Beta Band. The Beta Band feature quite strongly in the High Fidelity soundtrack. So,
yeah.
he and Nick Hornby had sort of met before, and Beta Band really were a big influence on me early doors. That idea of kind of bit of folk, lovely melodies, but a bit of hip hop, a bit of beats, a bit of programming. And yeah, I don't know if my music would have come out sounding the way it did at the beginning without the Beta Band. So that was a real nice thing for me. But yeah, you made a really good point, Frankie. I think most of them were quite up for having a go at it. A few came back saying, "Oh, I've never done anything like this before." Okay, well, do you think I can, sort of thing? And I was like, well, really, one of the big things for me was I was curious, having somebody who's been a bit of a control freak over the years, and worked, despite the Mull pseudonym, always been kind of solo and written all my songs myself. I was curious to get involved more in collaboration and really to know how Elton works with Bernie Taupin, because we all know, famously Elton John doesn't write his words. And I thought, what would it be like to plonk a sheet on the piano the way Elton does and see how you respond to someone else's words? So, yeah, so I think there was a mixed bag of some who very much, like Ian Rankin, his bedroom rocket ship was really quite formed. Lyrically, it was, you could almost see the verses. And then other people, it was Val McDermid, the other famous crime writer, Jason Mott, North Carolina, who won the National Book Award with a great book called Hell of a Book, actually. But so he's a kind of bestseller. His was stories of quite a rural setting, North Carolina, of a room that belonged to his uncle. The kind of decay of this room and the animals kind of taking over, and so you had to try and find a connection with them all. But yeah, there was a mixed bag of some who I think very much were used to the idea of stepping out of their comfort zone, and some were a wee bit cautious. Interesting you mentioned Pat though, because I've played football with Pat quite a bit, actually, Pat Nevin, and
Really?
I was quite pleased in his book to get a little mention alongside a football midfield sort of setup he was part of in a game we played with Stuart Murdoch, Bell and Sebastian, and Pat and myself. And I think this was before Pat had his hips done. being that junky winger, I think he'd done both his hits over the year, but he was still fantastic even before the operations. But yeah, no, it's really, I mean, again, there's an example of someone else, as you say, who well known for one area, but actually is very passionate about music in other areas. So it's been really nice now to get some of the feedback from the authors. The album's finished, obviously, and they've been shared some kind of private links pre-release. So it's been really quite nice to see what they've made of it, and thankfully, it feels like they're all quite happy with it.
Good. 2001 was the release of Loss, wasn't it? Your first album, I believe. That's without being rude. It's a bit of time now between then and now, Colin. And you must have seen quite a lot of changes in the music industry, as I have in half the time. But what is your perspective now? And I guess with this, you're doing something that's interesting to yourself, which is keeping which is keeping you excited about this project, isn't it? I mean, I think it's actually there's no one else doing anything like this right now, which is I think it's going to hit quite a sweet spot in terms of getting the message out there about what your project is about. But generally speaking, what's your perspective on the music industry right now? Maybe not comparing it to back then, but I mean, what do you think right now of like a band starting out? What the chances are to get stuff on the radio, to do conversations like this, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I do have quite a perspective on that because I also work at the BIM Institute, British Institute of Music. So I work kind of mentoring some of the sort of songwriting and performance and production students. And I'd never done anything like that before. It was a new thing to me, sort of just before lockdown. And so it is really great to see some, the emerging songwriters, to be around a lot of young people and to try and think, well, exactly, my journey is my journey, but everyone's journey is different. But I suppose I can say that those kind of dreams I had growing up in the Hebrides of, I don't know, making music, getting out there, getting to Abbey Road, getting to sort of just tour, go on a festival stage. I'd never been to a festival until I played one, I can identify with my journey, but everyone's journey is different, and it's interesting to see where they're at now. And obviously how music is distributed and consumed has changed vastly. But some things I think remain the same. I find myself, if there's a book in me about, maybe I'll just say this now, but if there's a book in me about creativity, I think I've got to call it What Makes You Original. Because I just feel like that's the one message that I try and pass on, because, ultimately I was in Glasgow during that sort of early noughties period you talked about, of trying to get my music going, playing football, all these bands, Snow Patrol, Belle and Sebastian, Teenage Fan Club, some of whom had come before me, but I was trying to get myself into this world. And actually, in some ways, when I came up with the Mull Historical Society song, which then became my music identity, it actually helped kind of realize my music more. I realized it gave it a bit of a geography, it gave it something different, and I think it's important to tap into originality. And I think that doesn't change, in terms of trying to be authentic. And it's very easy to sound like the current big thing, but to try and sort of be influenced by things, but come out with something hopefully original. In terms of how the industry shifted, I mean, I just find that for me, I've always had ambitions in writing. I mentioned my poet grandfather, probably still my biggest inspiration. So for me, it's about, maybe people in round boardrooms would say diversifying or something like that. But I suppose for me, it is about trying to tap into other ways of being creative, other ways of income, other ways of staying creative and keeping doing what you're doing, So I think it is probably, I mean, what do you think? Is it a lot harder? Maybe it is a lot harder for people to break through, but I think back to those first tours. My first 3 tours, first one supporting Elbow, second one supporting REM, the Strokes, and then supporting REM, and I mean, and so that was quite a good education. And I wish I could remember more of it all, to be honest. But you know, it was an exciting time, and maybe I came in at that point where, you know, you know, things were starting to shift in terms of how streaming technology was changing the industry, but there was still some of that kind of old industry there as well. And you know, I still remember getting my first tour bus and
Yeah.
signing with Rough Trade, and then signing with Warner's, and first night playing with the Strokes in Brighton, where they had a blue transit van, and I already had a tour bus, you know. And then within 3 nights, they had a tour bus as well, you know.
Yeah.
And would that happen to a newly signed artist now? I mean, maybe that's, you know, maybe that kind of backing is harder to achieve, but I still believe if something's really strong, you know, and has some originality about it, then hopefully Amazing Radio pick up on it and
Well,
others.
originality has longevity, hasn't it?
Well, that's it. That's why you do what you do, Frankie. You've just put that in a glorious nutshell. Originality has longevity, and I suppose that for me, I always thought I want to have, you know, there's lots of artists who were maybe around when I broke through, who maybe might have broke through even bigger, but you know, I always sort of felt, well, I want to kind of continue doing what I do because it's just part of me. You know, I did it.
Yeah.
I did it when I was a kid, growing up in an island, long before anyone was playlisting me or, you know, giving me tour buses. You know, so not that I ever owned one, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I think things have changed, but you know, some things remain the same, and I think just if you can keep your ideas going and keep finding other ways to be creative. And for me, the kind of songwriting comes from the same place as the book writing.
Yeah.
So I've got a new novel out later this year, and that's a whole new kind of journey for me in learning, you know, but it sort of feels like I'm tapping into the same sources, you know, in terms of being inspired.
Yeah. And is success seen as getting your work where you enjoy art now? So, you know, for you now, getting this to some appropriate festivals with this new project, you know, and appearing at those, getting your new book featured in, you know, certain charts, or doing book talks at national or in, you know, local Waterstone stores, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I guess coming from a new artist as well, seeing their work where they consume, so maybe on their favorite YouTube channel, or maybe getting their favorite TikTok star to mention it or do a collab on one of their 30 seconds of their song. I guess, you know, I've always seen success as seeing your work where you listen to other people's.
Yeah, really, really interesting point. I think that's absolutely right. And I probably, because the book writing is a little bit newer to me, I probably identify with that even more in that sense. Like my local bookshop, when I
Yeah.
saw my novel in the local bookshop, you're absolutely right. I sort of thought, well, I'm not just going to stop there, but that was, you know, that was a moment where I
Mission
thought, and
accomplished in a certain sense, isn't it?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you've been going there getting books for years. Same as
yeah.
when, you know, you go down your local record shop and they've got your album in for, you know, and you go out and buy it there, don't you? You know, that kind of thing,
Oh,
isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. I can still remember. Same. I'm just thinking the first time I saw my album, you know, in a record shop in Glasgow, with FOP, where I used to go a lot in the West End. You know, it was just so. Yeah, I think you have your own kind of barometer, and then I can remember playing first US tour, and then seeing it, you know, in like playing Tower Records in LA, and sort of thinking, you know, how the hell did this happen? You know, we didn't even have a record, didn't even have a record shop in Isle of Mull. Um, but yeah, so you're right. Those are sort of barometers of feeling like, okay, I've achieved something. But I suppose I've always, you know, I've always been quite driven creatively to get ideas out, and the things that I see around me, the comments I want to make, or the stuff that inspires you to write, whether they be national stories, local things, or relationships, or, you know, whatever it is, you try and sort of find ways of getting those subjects into your songs. I mean, that's what ultimately matters, and just trying to keep that going. But yeah, and festival wise, you're right as well. I mean, I'm doing the next stop. We launched the kind of in my mind as a room the album at the Hay Festival a couple of weeks ago, which was fun, because again, I've always wanted to do that one, and I hadn't done it with my writing yet, so it was quite nice to kind of go there. My daughter got Dua Lipa's autograph, so that was that was a huge achievement on my behalf, really. Yeah. And next up is the Borders Book Festival, which is fantastic, which is this Saturday. Doing that with Al McDermid, who's one of the authors on the
Yeah.
album. And then Belladrum coming up. And so, yeah, an Edinburgh Festival. And so you're right. I think you want to get out and play as much as you can. And just, it's funny you mentioned Lost, my first album. The alternative title I realized quite recently, rediscovered, was actually Community. And so I suppose ultimately, whether it's on the page or on the stage, you're just trying to reach a community, you try to build that sort of fan base and people that care about what you do, and you very much care about them over the years, so yeah, it feels quite nice to be at this stage with new things out again.
No, well, I love what I've heard so far. 1952, the single is out now, and I can't wait to get the record. 21st of July, so we don't have to wait too long, do we, Colin?
For the album, no, that's the album, absolutely. And another track coming up with Nick Hornby's words on it. I'll be following up 52. So yeah, great. Thank you, Frankie. I'm really pleased you're enjoying it, and nice to be back on Amazing.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks. We'll speak to you soon.